Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today, we bring you a new story, Joshua's complete story, the man who took Moses' place and changed biblical history. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. The content of this video has been compiled from various sources, so if there are any omissions or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. What if one of the most important leaders in the entire Bible was never meant to be remembered as a king, a prophet, or even a miracle worker, but simply as the man who stepped into an impossible shadow? Moses had split the sea. Moses had faced Pharaoh. Moses had spoken with God on the mountain, and now Moses was dead. In front of Joshua stood a flooded river, heavily fortified cities, fractured tribes, terrifying enemies, and a promise that had remained unfulfilled for generations. But Joshua's story did not begin there. It began in slavery, in the dust of Egypt, where a nameless Hebrew child grew up under oppression, long before he ever became a commander. This is not just the story of battles and conquest. It is the story of patience, fear, leadership, faith, devastating mistakes, political crises, covenant loyalty, and one of the most consequential transitions of power in biblical history. Because the real story of Joshua is far more complex, far more human, and far more historically fascinating than most people realize. Long before Joshua ever stood at the edge of the Jordan River, long before armies marched under his command, long before his name became inseparably linked with conquest, covenant, and the promised land, he was simply a Hebrew child, born into one of the harshest realities imaginable. To understand Joshua, we must begin not with victory, but with oppression, not with leadership, but with survival. The biblical text does not give us a dramatic birth narrative for Joshua the way it does for Moses. There are no hidden baskets drifting through reeds, no royal palace adoption, no miraculous childhood episodes. In fact, Joshua enters Scripture almost quietly. But silence in biblical narrative does not mean insignificance. Often it means the story assumes the audience understands the world that shaped the man. And Joshua's world was Egypt. According to the biblical account, the Israelites had lived in Egypt for generations after the days of Joseph. But the political climate changed dramatically. Exodus describes a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, meaning either literal ignorance or, more likely, a regime no longer interested in honoring older political alliances. What followed was systematic oppression. The Hebrews were transformed from a tolerated ethnic minority into a labor force. They built storage cities, worked under forced labor, and lived beneath the machinery of imperial exploitation. Whether one reads the Exodus account through a confessional lens, a historical critical lens, or a hybrid of both, the narrative intention is unmistakable. Israel's national identity begins not in triumph, but in bondage. Joshua was born into that world. His original name was Hoshea, meaning something like salvation or deliverance. Later, Moses would rename him Joshua, Yehoshua, meaning the Lord is salvation. That name change is deeply symbolic, but in the beginning, Joshua was simply another child among an oppressed people. If the traditional chronology is followed, Joshua would have been born during the final phase of Israel's Egyptian captivity, meaning he may have personally experienced the atmosphere of fear, labor, ethnic humiliation, and uncertainty that defined Hebrew life under Pharaoh. This matters because Joshua was not shaped by privilege. He was not raised in political comfort. Unlike Moses, who spent part of his early life in Pharaoh's household, according to Exodus, Joshua emerged from the collective suffering of ordinary Israelites. That distinction becomes psychologically important later. Moses knew both palace and wilderness. Joshua likely knew only the reality of his people. He belonged to the tribe of Ephraim, one of the major tribes descending from Joseph through Ephraim rather than Manasseh. This is politically significant because Ephraim would later become one of the dominant tribal identities in Israel's story. But at Joshua's birth, tribal prestige meant little under slavery. Ancient empires did not care much about preserving the dignity of conquered labor populations. From a historical standpoint, discussions about the precise dating and mechanisms of Israel's presence in Egypt remain debated among scholars. Some argue for a historical core behind the Exodus tradition. Others see the narrative as later theological memory shaped into national identity literature. Archaeology has not produced a universally accepted confirmation of every biblical detail. But for narrative interpretation, what matters is how the text frames Joshua's origin. He emerges from collective suffering, and that theological memory defines his character. Imagine growing up hearing stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob while living as a slave. Imagine hearing promises of land, descendants, blessing, and covenant while carrying bricks for imperial construction. That contrast would shape an entire worldview. Promise versus reality. Faith versus visible oppression. Hope versus humiliation. Joshua's generation inherited unresolved tension. They were told they belonged to God, yet politically they belonged to Pharaoh. This creates the kind of psychological environment where either despair or radical resilience can emerge. The biblical portrait suggests Joshua became the latter. One of the most interesting aspects of Joshua's early formation is what Scripture does not say. It does not portray him as a born genius, charismatic prodigy, or prophetic wonder child. His greatness appears to be formed gradually through loyalty, discipline, and endurance, rather than immediate spectacle. That makes him different from many dramatic biblical figures. He feels historically human, more shaped than suddenly revealed, more forged than discovered. This is precisely what makes his later rise compelling. Because when audiences think of biblical leaders, they often imagine immediate divine selection accompanied by unmistakable miracles. Joshua's story works differently. His emergence feels like the slow construction of a leader inside history. By the time the Exodus occurs, Joshua would likely have been a young man, old enough to remember Egyptian domination, but young enough to belong to the generation shaped by liberation rather than total desert mortality. This places him in a unique generational position. He was old enough to understand slavery, but young enough to become the future. That matters enormously. Leaders formed entirely in freedom think differently from leaders who remember chains. Joshua remembered chains, and memory changes leadership. A person who has seen oppression firsthand often understands risk, fear, and survival differently from someone raised in stability. This may help explain Joshua's later seriousness, discipline, and military competence. He was not merely inheriting a mission. He had lived the consequences of failure. Theologically, Joshua's beginnings also establish a recurring biblical theme. God often raises leaders from unexpected places, not always from institutions of prestige, but from contexts of suffering, obscurity, and dependence. Joshua's rise fits that pattern. Yet, unlike Moses, whose story begins with extraordinary preservation, Joshua's origin is almost anonymous. That anonymity is powerful. It means his significance is not rooted in mythic birth circumstances, but in what he becomes through history. And perhaps that is exactly the point. Before Joshua became the man who would lead Israel into Canaan, he was first a witness to bondage. Before he learned command, he learned survival. Before he carried military responsibility, he carried inherited trauma. The complete story of Joshua does not begin with conquest. It begins in Egypt, where a child born under oppression could not possibly know that one day he would become the successor to the greatest leader Israel had ever known. If chapter 1 was about survival, chapter 2 is about transformation. Because Joshua does not remain merely a former slave shaped by oppression, he becomes something far more dangerous, a disciplined leader forged in crisis. And the first time Scripture brings Joshua fully into focus, It does not place him in a classroom, a sanctuary, or a political ceremony. It places him on a battlefield. This is our first true encounter with Joshua as an active participant in Israel's national story, and the setting matters enormously. Exodus 17 presents a moment of sudden vulnerability. Israel has escaped Egypt, crossed the sea, and entered the wilderness. But freedom has not brought immediate stability. Liberation is not the same thing as nationhood. Former slaves are not automatically an organized society. They are traumatized, mobile, uncertain, and logistically fragile. This is precisely the kind of population vulnerable to attack. Enter the Amalekites. The Amalekites were a semi-nomadic people associated with regions south of Canaan, often remembered in biblical tradition as persistent enemies of Israel. Historically, precise identification remains debated, but within the narrative they represent the harsh realities of survival in the ancient Near Eastern wilderness. This is no symbolic disagreement. This is military threat. A newly liberated people without long-term battlefield organization is suddenly forced into armed conflict. And then, in a remarkable narrative move, Moses turns to Joshua. Not Aaron, not a tribal elder, not a priest, Joshua. Exodus 17:9 records Moses saying, "Choose for us men, and go out, fight with Amalek." This is Joshua's first explicit appearance as a military commander. The moment is astonishing when you think about it. Joshua has no recorded military resume, no introduction explaining his qualifications, no backstory describing earlier campaigns. Scripture simply presents him as someone Moses trusts with immediate battlefield responsibility. That implies Joshua had already demonstrated competence, discipline, or reliability behind the scenes. Leadership opportunities in ancient crisis settings were not handed out casually, especially not by someone like Moses, who carried extraordinary national responsibility. Joshua's role here reveals something crucial. He is not merely a faithful believer. He is operationally capable. He can organize men, respond under pressure, and function inside violent uncertainty. That is a very different skill set from prophetic leadership. This begins one of the most important dynamics in Joshua's character formation. Moses and Joshua represent complementary modes of leadership. Moses ascends the hill with the staff of God. Joshua enters the battlefield below. Moses intercedes. Joshua fights. The narrative intentionally creates this visual contrast. Divine dependence and human action are not presented as opposites. They are intertwined. As long as Moses' hands remain raised, Israel prevails. When they drop, Amalek gains ground. Aaron and Hur support Moses physically, while Joshua leads tactically. This is one of the most sophisticated leadership images in the Pentateuch. No single individual carries every function. Victory requires layered cooperation. Joshua's military role here also matters psychologically. Remember who he is. This is a man likely born under slavery, a member of an oppressed labor population. And now he is commanding free men in battle against external enemies. That transformation is profound. Slavery teaches submission, survival, and endurance. Military leadership requires initiative, confidence, decisiveness, and organized force. Joshua is becoming a different kind of human being, not because trauma vanished, but because purpose reshaped him. Historically, if we imagine the practical realities, organizing recently liberated former laborers into combat units would have been extraordinarily difficult. Ancient warfare required discipline, courage, weapons familiarity, and cohesion. Israel at this stage is not portrayed as a polished, standing army. This makes Joshua's effectiveness even more significant. Exodus says, Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. The text offers minimal tactical detail, because its primary theological emphasis lies elsewhere. But the outcome is unmistakable. Joshua succeeds. This matters because first impressions in narrative memory are powerful. Joshua enters Scripture not as a hesitant novice, but as a functioning, wartime leader. Yet the story carefully avoids turning him into an independent hero. Moses remains central. God remains decisive. Joshua is competent, but not autonomous. That balance becomes foundational for his identity. He is not a rogue military genius. He is a servant leader, operating under covenant authority. This distinction protects the biblical narrative from becoming mere conquest mythology. The story is not celebrating brute force. It is presenting leadership under divine mission. There is another fascinating dimension here. Joshua's military leadership begins before his deeper theological prominence becomes visible. In many modern contexts, people assume spiritual leaders emerge first through theological formation, then administrative experience. Joshua's path appears reversed. He first proves reliability in action. Then he grows into deeper proximity with Moses and sacred leadership. This is historically plausible. Ancient leadership often emerged through demonstrated competence in crisis, rather than formal institutional pathways. But it also creates narrative depth. Joshua is not simply taught abstract principles. He learns under pressure. He learns while lives are at stake. He learns in situations where failure has immediate consequences. That kind of formation changes a person permanently. The battle with Amalek also introduces Joshua to a hard truth about leadership in Israel's story. Freedom does not eliminate conflict. Leaving Egypt did not mean entering peace. Deliverance was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a different kind of struggle. That lesson will define Joshua's life. The Promised Land itself will require campaigns, negotiations, discipline, and painful decisions. In that sense, Amalek is a training ground, not merely militarily, but psychologically. Joshua learns that covenant people still face danger. He learns that leadership means responsibility under uncertainty. He learns that victory is neither automatic nor purely humanly engineered. Perhaps most importantly, he learns to operate near Moses. That relationship will become one of the defining mentorship dynamics in biblical history. Moses does not merely assign Joshua a task. He begins shaping a successor, though the text does not yet state this explicitly. Joshua is being observed, tested, trusted incrementally. Leadership succession in ancient settings rarely happened instantly. It emerged through repeated demonstrations of loyalty and capability. This battlefield may be the beginning of that process. For viewers, it is tempting to remember Joshua primarily as the conqueror of Jericho. But that would miss something essential. Joshua's public story begins much earlier, in a moment when Israel was still fragile and uncertain. Before he ever inherited Moses' mantle, he first learned to bear responsibility when outcomes were unclear and fear was real. The former slave had become a commander, but not yet the leader history would remember. That transformation had only just begun. If Joshua's first public appearance revealed him as a battlefield commander, the next phase of his story reveals something even more important: his proximity to sacred leadership. Because military competence alone does not explain why Joshua would eventually become Moses' successor. Ancient Israel was not merely a tribal coalition needing tactical command. It was a covenant community whose identity centered on relationship with God, law, memory, worship, and divine mission. A capable general could win battles, but that alone would not qualify him to lead Israel. What Joshua needed was not only battlefield credibility, but formation near the center of revelation itself. And that is exactly what begins to happen. One of the most fascinating things about Joshua's development is how quietly Scripture moves him closer and closer to Moses. The transformation is subtle, almost easy to miss if one reads quickly. But narratively, it is deliberate. Joshua is no longer simply the man fighting enemies below while Moses stands above. He is becoming the trusted attendant, the one allowed unusual proximity to the most consequential spiritual events in Israel's history. To understand the magnitude of this, we need to enter Sinai. In biblical memory, Mount Sinai is not just a mountain. It is one of the defining sacred spaces in all of Scripture. This is where covenant is formalized. This is where law is received. This is where Israel transitions from a liberated people into a covenant nation. The imagery is overwhelming. Thunder, fire, smoke, divine presence, boundaries around the mountain, fear among the people. The text in Exodus presents Sinai not as a peaceful retreat, but as a terrifying encounter between the holy and the human. The people are warned not to approach carelessly. Even animals crossing the boundary face death. This is sacred danger. And in that environment, Joshua appears in a remarkable role. Exodus 24 tells us Moses rose with Joshua, his assistant, and went up the mountain of God. That brief line is astonishing. Not because Joshua receives revelation directly in the same way Moses does. He does not. But because he is permitted closer access than the general population. That distinction matters. Access in ancient religious systems signified trust, hierarchy, and legitimacy. Joshua is being positioned in a unique relational space. He is not the prophet, but he is near the prophet. He is not the covenant mediator, but he is near the mediator. He is not the lawgiver, but he is near the giving of the law. This shapes identity. Imagine the psychological experience. Joshua, once a child of slavery, now ascending toward the symbolic center of divine encounter in Israel's foundational story. The same man who had fought Amalek now walks partway into sacred terrain, where most dare not approach. That movement tells us something profound about leadership formation in biblical thought. Great leaders are not formed merely by public victories. They are formed through proximity to wisdom, responsibility, and sacred seriousness. Historically speaking, ancient mentorship structures often worked through relational closeness rather than formal instruction manuals. Apprentices learned by presence, observation, and participation. Joshua's role fits this model beautifully. He is not merely attending lectures. He is accompanying Moses through history, watching decisions, observing pressure, learning rhythms of leadership. This kind of formation creates depth that theoretical instruction alone cannot produce. It is also significant that Joshua is explicitly called Moses' assistant or attendant. The Hebrew terminology suggests service, support, close function. Modern audiences sometimes underestimate servant roles, because contemporary culture often glamorizes immediate leadership. But in ancient contexts, proximity through service could be one of the most formative leadership pathways imaginable. Joshua is learning not by dominating space, but by faithfully inhabiting it. That becomes a defining characteristic. Unlike figures who seize power dramatically, Joshua's leadership emerges through disciplined loyalty. There is another intriguing detail in Exodus 33. The text describes the tent of meeting, where Moses would speak with God, and notes that Joshua, son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. This line has fascinated interpreters for centuries. It suggests unusual devotion, unusual access, or, at minimum, unusual consistency of presence. We must be careful not to overstate what the text explicitly claims. Joshua is not being portrayed as Moses' equal in revelation, but neither is he merely a passive assistant carrying supplies. Something deeper is happening. He is being shaped by nearness to sacred encounter. This matters enormously for the larger Joshua story, because one of the most dangerous leadership transitions in history is moving from military authority into spiritual authority without moral formation. Ancient history offers countless examples of competent commanders becoming destructive rulers. The biblical narrative seems determined to show that Joshua's preparation was broader than warfare. He needed formation in covenant consciousness, not just battlefield efficiency. Sinai helps explain why Joshua later speaks and acts not merely as a tactician, but as a covenant leader. Yet this proximity also raises human questions. What did Joshua actually understand at this stage? How much did he comprehend about the enormity of what was unfolding? Scripture does not fully say. That ambiguity is realistic. Apprentices often witness events whose full significance becomes clear only later. Joshua may have sensed importance without grasping ultimate implications. That, too, is part of authentic formation. Leadership often begins with faithful presence before full understanding. There is also emotional depth here. Joshua's closeness to Moses likely created profound attachment. Moses was not merely a national icon. He was mentor, authority figure, and perhaps the most stabilizing human presence in Joshua's adult life. This relationship will matter dramatically when succession eventually becomes necessary. Leadership transfer is never merely institutional, it is personal, and the deeper the mentorship, the heavier the transition. From a narrative perspective, Joshua's mountain proximity serves another function. It differentiates him from the broader rebellious tendencies emerging among Israel. While others panic, complain, or remain distant, Joshua is repeatedly associated with loyalty and presence. The contrast is building. Scripture is slowly constructing credibility, not through loud self-promotion, but through accumulated evidence. Reliability in war, faithfulness in service, proximity to revelation, consistency under pressure. These are the ingredients of biblical succession. Sinai also reinforces a central theological idea. Leadership in Israel is not fundamentally self-generated. It emerges under divine order. Joshua's closeness to sacred space is not about personal ambition. It is about preparation inside a covenant framework larger than himself. That distinction separates biblical leadership from raw ancient power politics. Although politics remain real, the narrative frames legitimacy differently. Joshua is not climbing through intrigue. He is being formed through faithfulness. And perhaps that is what makes this chapter so essential. Because if chapter 2 proved Joshua could fight, chapter 3 proves he could remain near holiness without becoming consumed by ego. The former slave is becoming more than a soldier. He is becoming a man shaped by presence, discipline, and sacred responsibility. Long before he would ever lead Israel into the Promised Land, Joshua first learned what it meant to stand near the mountain of God. If the previous chapter showed Joshua standing near sacred revelation, this chapter reveals what happens when sacred proximity collides with human failure. Because one of the most devastating crises in early Israelite history erupts not on a battlefield, but within the covenant community itself. And for Joshua, this moment becomes a critical test, not of military competence, but of perception, loyalty, and identity. The golden calf incident is one of the most iconic episodes in the Hebrew Bible, but its familiarity can make modern audiences underestimate how politically explosive and theologically catastrophic it really was. Israel had only recently experienced liberation from Egypt, dramatic deliverance at the sea, provision in the wilderness, and the terrifying covenant encounter at Sinai. The expectation might be that such overwhelming experiences would produce enduring faithfulness. Instead, the opposite happens. Moses remains on the mountain for an extended period, and uncertainty begins to rot the collective psyche. Delay becomes destabilizing. The people approach Aaron with a demand that is as revealing as it is dangerous. Make us gods who shall go before us, because as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. That statement is psychologically rich. It reveals impatience, insecurity, dependency on visible leadership, and spiritual confusion. Ancient people were not uniquely irrational in this regard. Humans across history struggle with uncertainty, especially when charismatic leadership disappears from view. But in Israel's covenant framework, this moment is more than emotional instability. It is covenant violation. The golden calf is not merely a bad decision. It is theological rebellion. Whether the calf represents an alternative deity, an attempted visible representation of Israel's God, or some hybrid symbolic misunderstanding remains debated among interpreters. But the narrative verdict is clear. This is a profound betrayal, and Joshua is caught in the middle of it, though in a revealingly different way from the rest of the nation. Exodus 32 places Joshua descending with Moses after the crisis has already unfolded below. What happens next is one of the most human moments in Joshua's early story. Hearing the noise from the camp, Joshua says to Moses, "There is a noise of war in the camp." That statement matters because it reveals both his instincts and his limitations. Joshua hears chaos and interprets it militarily. Why? Because that is part of how he has been formed. He is the battlefield commander, the man whose mind reads threat through conflict categories. Noise equals battle. Disorder equals attack. That interpretation is understandable, even logical, but Moses immediately corrects him. It is not the sound of victory, not the sound of defeat. It is singing. The scene is cinematic. Joshua, trained to detect external enemies, misreads the deeper threat because the enemy is internal corruption. This is one of the most important leadership lessons in his formation. Not all crises come from outside. Some emerge from within the very people one is called to lead. That realization changes everything. Leaders who understand only external threats become vulnerable to internal collapse. Joshua must learn this lesson early. Yet the narrative does not portray his misreading as moral failure, quite the opposite. His instinct reveals seriousness. He assumes danger because danger has been real. More importantly, he is descending with Moses, not participating in the rebellion below. This distinction is crucial. While much of Israel abandons covenant fidelity in a moment of panic and symbolic self-invention, Joshua remains aligned with Moses. Even if imperfect in perception, he is correctly positioned in loyalty. That may be the deeper point. Biblical leadership is not defined by omniscience. It is defined by covenant alignment. Joshua does not understand everything, but he stands in the right place. Historically, the golden calf episode also reflects broader ancient Near Eastern religious realities. Bull or calf imagery carried symbolic significance in multiple cultures, often associated with strength, fertility, or divine representation. Egypt itself had bovine religious symbolism, including the Apis bull tradition. This does not prove direct borrowing in a simplistic sense, but it helps modern audiences understand why such imagery would feel culturally intelligible. Former slaves do not instantly shed all symbolic frameworks from their environment. Cultural memory lingers. The golden calf may reflect not sudden invention, but confused continuity with surrounding religious imagination. That makes the event even more psychologically plausible. Liberation changes geography faster than it changes consciousness. Joshua, however, appears increasingly distinct from that pattern. His proximity to Moses has been reshaping him differently. This is not because Joshua is naturally superior. The narrative never presents him as morally flawless. Rather, he is being formed through loyalty, discipline, and relational proximity to covenant leadership. That formation creates divergence between him and the broader rebellious instincts of the crowd. This divergence will become critical later, because succession depends not merely on competence, but trustworthiness under communal pressure. The golden calf crisis also exposes a brutal truth about leadership. A population can experience extraordinary deliverance and still become unstable quickly when leadership seems absent. That is not just ancient history. It is a recurring human phenomenon. Institutions, movements, and nations often discover that shared crisis does not automatically create lasting maturity. Joshua is watching this in real time. The same people delivered from Egypt can become spiritually volatile within weeks. Imagine the emotional effect. Joshua had fought for this people, climbed with Moses for this people, shared hardship with this people, and now he witnesses collective betrayal. Such moments either harden leaders into cynicism or deepen their realism. Joshua appears to become the latter. He learns not to romanticize the people he will eventually lead. That lesson matters enormously. Another dimension often overlooked is the personal impact on Joshua's relationship with Moses. Shared crisis deepens mentorship. Witnessing catastrophe alongside a leader changes the bond. Joshua is no longer merely an assistant, observing impressive moments. He is present in collapse, judgment, and emotional devastation. Moses' anger, shattered tablets, confrontation with Aaron, judgment against rebellion, all of this forms part of Joshua's leadership education. Not theoretical leadership, crisis leadership, messy leadership, painful leadership, the kind that reveals what governance actually costs. Theologically, the golden calf becomes a defining memory for Israel because it crystallizes a central covenant tension. Divine grace and human instability exist side by side. Joshua's leadership will later operate within that same tension. He will lead people capable of faith and rebellion, courage and fear, loyalty and compromise. This crisis prepares him for that reality. Most importantly, the golden calf reveals Joshua's most underrated trait: durable loyalty. He is not yet the central figure. He does not seize the moment. He does not exploit Moses' vulnerability. He does not join the majority for safety. He remains where covenant fidelity requires him to remain. In political history, succession candidates often emerge through ambition, maneuvering, or opportunism. Joshua's emergence looks profoundly different. His credibility grows through faithful presence in moments when others collapse. And perhaps that is why this chapter matters so much. Because before Joshua could ever become the leader of Israel, he first had to prove that he would remain loyal when leadership itself seemed uncertain. The battlefield had tested his courage. Sinai's collapse tested his character. By this point in Joshua's story, the pattern is becoming unmistakable. He has survived slavery, proven himself in battle, stood near the mountain of revelation, and remained loyal during one of Israel's most humiliating covenant failures. But chapter 5 becomes the defining turning point of his entire early life. Because here, Joshua is no longer simply supporting history from the background. Here, he steps directly into one of the most consequential decisions in Israel's national memory. And the choice he makes will define not only his reputation, but his destiny. The setting is Kadesh Barnea, a location that may sound geographically technical to modern audiences, but in biblical history it represents something emotionally explosive. Israel is no longer merely wandering in abstraction. They are at the threshold of the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After generations of slavery, dramatic liberation, covenant formation, wilderness dependence, and repeated instability, the objective appears finally within reach. The promise is no longer theoretical. It is visible. But visible promise creates a new kind of crisis, because reality now demands decision. Numbers 13 tells us 12 men are selected to scout the land of Canaan, one representative from each tribe. This is not a random reconnaissance unit. It is a politically symbolic delegation. Each man carries tribal legitimacy. Each report will shape national perception. And among them is Joshua. Though at this stage the text notes the shift from his earlier name, Hoshea, to the name Moses gives him, Joshua, meaning the Lord is salvation. That name change is narratively significant. Identity is being reframed. Joshua is no longer merely a man associated with deliverance in abstract terms. His very name now explicitly anchors salvation in God. That matters, because what follows is fundamentally a crisis of interpretation. The scouts spend 40 days surveying the land. They observe agricultural abundance, fortified settlements, and formidable inhabitants. The famous imagery of a cluster of grapes so large it requires carrying between men serves literary and symbolic purposes. The land is undeniably fruitful. The promise appears materially real. But the same evidence produces radically different conclusions. This is where the story becomes psychologically brilliant. Because the disagreement is not about facts, it is about interpretation. The majority report is not entirely fabricated. They really do see strong cities. They really do perceive military challenges. They really do feel small in comparison to certain populations described in dramatic terms. Fear is not always born from false information. Sometimes it emerges from accurate observation, interpreted without confidence. That distinction matters enormously. The 10 spies are not necessarily lying in every detail. They are framing reality through fear. Joshua and Caleb frame the same reality differently. This is what makes the story so enduring. Leadership often hinges not on access to data, but on interpretation of data under pressure. The majority says the obstacles are too great. Joshua and Caleb say the promise remains greater. Notice what is happening to Joshua here. This is no longer merely a test of loyalty to Moses. It is a test of conviction against collective panic. That is far harder. Loyalty to a respected mentor is one thing. Standing against overwhelming public consensus is another. Numbers describes the people reacting emotionally, weeping, complaining, and even discussing appointing new leadership to return to Egypt. That last detail is devastating. Egypt, the place of slavery, the place of oppression, the place from which deliverance had defined their identity. Under fear, memory becomes distorted. The familiar misery of the past begins to feel safer than the uncertain promise of the future. This is profoundly human. People often prefer known suffering to unknown responsibility. Joshua sees this in real time, and then he does something politically dangerous. He speaks against the emotional majority. He and Caleb tear their garments, a visible sign of anguish, and plead with the people. The land is exceedingly good. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into it. Do not rebel. Do not fear. This is not reckless optimism. That is a common misreading. Joshua is not denying military reality. He is reordering interpretive priorities. His logic is covenantal, not naive. The question is not whether enemies exist. The question is whether divine promise governs action. Historically, from a military perspective, the fears of the 10 spies are understandable. Late Bronze Age Canaan contained fortified urban centers, regional powers, complex political structures, and strategic challenges. Ancient warfare was brutal and uncertain. Israel, despite previous experiences, was not obviously an unstoppable imperial machine. So if one reads the story purely through conventional military analysis, caution makes sense. But the biblical narrative is not purely military history. It is theological history. The crisis is not about whether conquest would be difficult. It is about whether fear will override covenant trust. Joshua's position here is transformational because it reveals leadership under social hostility. Earlier tests involved proximity to Moses or structured roles. Here, Joshua stands exposed before a terrified nation. And what does the nation do? They consider stoning him and Caleb. This is critical. Faithful leadership is not always admired in the moment. Sometimes it is perceived as dangerous disruption. Joshua learns that truth brutally early. The people are not merely unconvinced, they are enraged. That emotional violence matters. Leadership under fear can become politically lethal. Yet Joshua does not retreat. This becomes one of the clearest indicators of his future leadership suitability. He can endure communal pressure without abandoning conviction. The consequences of this episode are catastrophic. God declares judgment on the generation marked by rebellion. The wilderness wandering extends for 40 years until that generation dies out, with Joshua and Caleb as the notable exceptions. This is one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history. An entire generational transition is triggered by collective refusal. And Joshua must live with the consequences. Think about that. Joshua makes the faithful choice, yet he still spends decades in wilderness delay because of the broader community's failure. This is one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of his story. Faithfulness does not produce immediate reward. Obedience does not exempt him from shared hardship. That experience would shape any leader profoundly. It teaches patience, realism, and emotional endurance. It also eliminates simplistic prosperity logic. Joshua's story does not say, "Trust God and everything becomes easy." It says, "Trust may still require long waiting, because leadership exists inside communal history, not isolated individual experience." Theologically, this is Joshua's defining emergence. Before this moment, he is promising. After this moment, he is marked. He becomes one of the only surviving representatives of a generation deemed unfit to enter the promise. His identity is permanently tied to courage under collective fear. And perhaps most importantly, Moses sees it. Israel sees it. History will remember it. This is the chapter where Joshua stops being merely the loyal assistant in the background and becomes the man whose faith distinguishes him from an entire generation. The warrior had already proven courage in battle, but here he proves something harder: courage against fear inside his own people. If chapter 5 was the great decision, chapter 6 is the long consequence. And in many ways, this may be the most psychologically important chapter in Joshua's entire life, precisely because it contains almost no dramatic spotlight, no famous battle, no triumphant speech, no cinematic miracle centered on his name. Just time. Endless, difficult, exhausting time. Modern storytelling often skips this kind of chapter because silence feels less exciting than action. But historically, spiritually, and psychologically, this is where some of the deepest leadership formation happens. Because Joshua now enters one of the strangest seasons imaginable. He was right, yet he still has to wait. He showed courage, yet he still suffers delay. He trusted the promise, yet he does not receive it immediately. Instead, he spends decades walking through wilderness because of the fear, rebellion, and failure of others. That reality is profoundly difficult. The biblical text presents the wilderness years as judgment on the unbelieving generation. But for Joshua, the experience is more complex than punishment. He is not wandering because he personally rejected the mission. He is wandering because leadership exists inside a community, and communities carry collective consequences. This is one of the harshest truths about public leadership. Even the faithful often endure fallout created by the unfaithful. Joshua must live with that reality for 40 years. Think about what that means emotionally. He had seen the land. He knew the promise was real. He had argued for courage. He had endured public hostility. He had watched the nation retreat from destiny. And now every passing year becomes a reminder of what could have happened sooner. Few experiences test character more severely than delayed vindication. It is one thing to make the right decision. It is another to live for decades without immediate reward. Many leaders can survive crisis. Far fewer can survive waiting. This is where Joshua's story becomes deeply human. Because Scripture does not give us detailed diary entries from these decades, we are not told every internal struggle, every conversation, every moment of frustration. But the silence itself invites reflection. What does a man like Joshua become during 40 years of suspended fulfillment? Cynical? Bitter? Impatient? Ambitious? Detached? Or something stronger? The later narrative suggests the last option, but that kind of resilience does not happen accidentally. Historically, the wilderness period in biblical narrative is not merely empty travel. It is a time of national formation. Laws are reinforced. Complaints erupt. Leadership crises continue. Generational turnover happens. The old generation dies, a new one emerges. Joshua is present through all of it. Which means, while the spotlight is often on Moses, Joshua is absorbing lessons constantly. This is perhaps the most important unofficial leadership academy in biblical history. Not a school, not a royal court, a wilderness of repeated pressure. Joshua watches Moses govern an extraordinarily difficult population. This matters more than modern audiences sometimes realize. Moses was not leading a disciplined, grateful nation. He was leading a volatile, frightened, often resistant people with recurring logistical, political, and spiritual crises. Food complaints, water crises, challenges to authority, internal rebellion, fear, fatigue, grief. Joshua witnesses all of it. Leadership theory becomes lived observation. How do you manage a people that constantly tests leadership legitimacy? How do you balance justice and mercy? How do you remain stable when those you lead are unstable? These are not abstract lessons. Joshua is seeing them in real time for decades. One of the most revealing episodes comes in Numbers 11, when Eldad and Medad prophesy in the camp and Joshua reacts protectively, urging Moses to stop them. Moses responds with remarkable humility, saying he wishes all the Lord's people were prophets. This small interaction tells us something important. Joshua's loyalty is intense, perhaps even protective to the point of narrowness. He wants to defend Moses' unique position. That instinct is understandable, but Moses gently expands his perspective. Leadership is not merely about protecting hierarchy. It is about recognizing broader divine purpose. Joshua learns from that too. This is mentorship in action. Correction without humiliation, formation through lived complexity. Another critical dimension of these decades is generational identity. Joshua is becoming a bridge figure. He remembers Egypt, unlike those born entirely in wilderness. He also will outlive the generation defined by fear. That gives him unusual perspective. He understands slavery and promise, failure and hope, memory, and future. Leaders who bridge generations often carry unique strategic value because they can interpret one world to another. Joshua becomes exactly that kind of figure. He knows where Israel came from. He also knows where it must go. From a psychological perspective, delayed leadership succession can be dangerous. A long-serving second in command may become resentful, politically restless, or self-promoting. Ancient history offers many examples of successors destabilizing systems before transition occurs. Joshua's story is remarkable precisely because we do not see that pattern. He does not undermine Moses. He does not build rival factions. He does not exploit Moses' aging authority. Instead, he remains in disciplined service. That may be one of the strongest arguments for his eventual suitability. Power delayed reveals character. Theologically, wilderness in biblical tradition often functions as a place of testing, dependence, and refinement. Joshua's wilderness is not simply geographical, it is existential. He is being prepared through deprivation of immediate fulfillment. This is deeply countercultural. Modern leadership imagination often prizes acceleration, rapid promotion, visible achievement. Joshua's formation argues for something radically different: depth before elevation, character before authority, endurance before inheritance. There is also a practical military angle. 40 years among a mobile tribal population in harsh conditions would not be irrelevant to a future commander. Logistics, movement, resource management, tribal dynamics, environmental adaptation, all of this would matter later. Leadership in conquest would require more than battlefield courage. It would require organizational understanding built over time. Joshua is gaining that, whether consciously or not. Yet perhaps the most emotionally difficult aspect remains the repeated funerals. Year after year, the old generation disappears. Friends, elders, familiar faces. The wilderness is not just waiting, it is attrition. Joshua lives through the slow death of an era. That changes a person. It strips away romanticism. It deepens seriousness. It makes future leadership less glamorous and more sobering. By the end of these decades, Joshua is no longer the younger commander first introduced in Exodus. He is seasoned, patient, historically aware, emotionally tested, and deeply shaped by long obedience without immediate reward. This chapter matters because it destroys simplistic leadership mythology. Joshua was not made in a single heroic moment. He was forged across decades of obscurity. If chapter 5 showed his faith under pressure, chapter 6 shows his endurance under delay. And in many ways, endurance is the harder test. Because courage in a moment can be dramatic, faithfulness over 40 years is transformational. When Joshua eventually takes command, he will not lead as an untested rising star. He will lead as a man who has spent most of his adult life being prepared in silence. 40 years of preparation had created a question that could no longer be postponed. What happens when Moses is gone? That question was not merely emotional. It was political, military, theological, and existential. Because Moses was not simply a leader, he was the defining human figure of Israel's national identity. He confronted Pharaoh, mediated covenant, received law, interceded during rebellion, governed through chaos. For an entire generation, Moses was the visible center of national continuity. And history repeatedly shows that transitions after dominant leaders are among the most dangerous moments any people can face. Institutions often appear stable until succession begins. Then hidden tensions surface. Rival ambitions emerge. Legitimacy fractures. Memory becomes weaponized. Israel now stood at exactly that kind of moment. And remarkably, the biblical narrative does not present succession as a spontaneous political contest. It presents it as a deliberate, public, structured transfer of authority. That distinction matters enormously. Chapter 7 is not simply about Joshua receiving a promotion. It is about legitimacy. Because leadership in biblical Israel could not survive merely on competence. It required recognized continuity, covenant coherence, and communal acceptance. Numbers 27 becomes the critical turning point. Moses, aware that his own journey is nearing its end, speaks to God about the future leadership of the people. His concern is strikingly pastoral. He asks for a leader so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep without a shepherd. That metaphor reveals something important about biblical leadership imagination. Leadership is not merely domination or command. It is responsibility for vulnerable people requiring guidance, protection, and continuity. Moses understands the stakes. A leadership vacuum at this stage could be catastrophic. Israel is approaching fulfillment of the land promise, surrounded by uncertainty, facing military challenges, tribal complexity, and internal fragility. This is the worst possible moment for ambiguity. God's answer is direct. Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit. Already that description is significant. Joshua is not introduced merely as experienced, loyal, or militarily competent, though he is all of those things. The language signals deeper qualification. Leadership in Israel is framed not merely administratively, but spiritually. That does not mean Joshua suddenly becomes another Moses in identical terms. The biblical text preserves distinctions between them. But it does mean his leadership is recognized as more than practical succession. There is divine endorsement. Moses is instructed to lay his hand on Joshua, present him before Eleazar the priest and the congregation, and publicly commission him. This ceremony is politically brilliant. Ancient transitions often failed because legitimacy remained private, ambiguous, or contested. Public ritual solves that problem. Everyone sees the transfer. Everyone witnesses the endorsement. Everyone understands continuity. This is not secret succession. It is national theater with theological meaning. The laying on of hands matters symbolically. Across biblical tradition, physical acts often communicate transfer, blessing, recognition, or delegated authority. Here, the act is not magical performance, but embodied legitimacy. Joshua is visibly marked as successor. Yet the text carefully nuances the transition. Moses is told to invest some of his authority in Joshua, not necessarily duplicate every aspect of Moses' role identically. This distinction is crucial. Successors are often damaged by impossible comparisons when expected to replicate legendary predecessors exactly. The biblical narrative avoids that simplistic trap. Joshua is legitimate, but not Moses rewritten. His leadership will have its own structure, strengths, and boundaries. Historically, this is highly realistic. Great political transitions rarely succeed through exact duplication. Durable succession requires continuity with adaptation. Another fascinating element is Eleazar's role. Joshua will consult through priestly mediation in certain decision-making contexts involving divine guidance. This differs from Moses' unique prophetic immediacy. Again, continuity with difference. The system is evolving. Leadership after Moses is not identical leadership. It is a reconfigured structure appropriate to new realities. This matters because biblical leadership is not static institutional nostalgia. It adapts while preserving covenant identity. Psychologically, imagine Joshua's position. For decades, he has served faithfully, but being a trusted lieutenant is profoundly different from becoming the designated successor to the most consequential leader in national history. The honor would be immense. So would the pressure. Successor psychology is uniquely difficult. Admiration for a mentor can intensify fear of inadequacy. Joshua had watched Moses confront divine encounter, rebellion, judgment, crisis, and national instability. Now the question becomes unavoidable. Can he possibly bear that weight? The narrative does not explicitly narrate every emotional layer here, but later passages strongly suggest Joshua understood the enormity of the assignment. This is not triumphalist career advancement. It is burden transfer. There is also a political dimension worth noticing. Why Joshua and not someone from the priestly line? Why not Aaron's descendants as broader national leaders? Why not another tribal elder? The answer lies partly in Joshua's accumulated credibility. He has military competence, covenant loyalty, public faithfulness, long-term service, generational continuity, and now, explicit divine endorsement. He represents a rare convergence of qualifications. Leadership succession in ancient tribal contexts required more than bloodline. It required perceived trustworthiness across multiple constituencies. Joshua had earned that. Deuteronomy intensifies the transition further. Moses publicly encourages Joshua, telling him to be strong and courageous. This phrase will become iconic, but here it functions with extraordinary emotional depth. Moses knows what lies ahead: conflict, resistance, responsibility, national expectation. The words are not motivational slogans, they are sober preparation. Courage is required because the task is genuinely daunting. Leadership succession is not glamorous inheritance, it is exposure to uncertainty. One of the most moving aspects of this chapter is Joshua's patience. He never appears to demand the role. He does not campaign, he does not gather factions, he does not manufacture urgency around Moses' aging condition. In political history, that restraint is unusual. Ambitious successors often destabilize transitions through premature maneuvering. Joshua's legitimacy is strengthened precisely because his ascent emerges through trust, not visible ambition. That reinforces the narrative theme developing since the beginning. Joshua becomes leader not by self-promotion, but through tested faithfulness over time. Theologically, this transition also marks a profound generational shift. The Exodus era is ending. Wilderness formation is ending. Promise fulfillment is approaching. Joshua embodies continuity between memory and future. He remembers slavery. He witnessed Sinai. He survived rebellion. He endured delay. Now he becomes the bridge into fulfillment. That symbolic role matters enormously. He is not merely the next administrator. He is the living connection between foundational history and coming destiny. Yet for all the public ceremony, one reality remains unresolved. Moses is still alive. Transition has been declared, but full transfer is not yet complete. This creates a psychologically delicate stage, familiar in many leadership systems. The successor is named, but the predecessor remains present. Navigating that requires humility from both sides. The biblical portrait suggests remarkable stability here. Moses empowers without jealousy. Joshua receives without arrogance. That is rare leadership maturity. Chapter 7 matters because it marks the end of preparation and the beginning of accountability. Joshua is no longer merely the promising assistant or faithful survivor. He is now the officially recognized future leader of Israel. The question is no longer whether he might lead someday. The question is whether he can carry the impossible inheritance of Moses when that day finally arrives. Everything in Joshua's life had been preparing for this moment, and yet nothing could truly prepare him for what it felt like when Moses was finally gone. For decades, Joshua had lived in the orbit of the greatest leader Israel had ever known. Moses was not merely a commander or administrator. He was the defining face of divine deliverance, covenant mediation, and national survival. Joshua had fought under him, learned beside him, watched him govern crises, and received his public endorsement. But mentorship, no matter how profound, cannot remove the terrifying loneliness of actual succession. There is always a moment when inherited preparation becomes personal responsibility. Joshua chapter 1 begins exactly there, in that psychologically brutal transition between preparation and command. Moses is dead. The sentence is stark because the reality was stark. Deuteronomy closes with mourning, final blessings, and the burial of Moses in mysterious terms that reinforce both his greatness and the end of his era. Then Joshua opens not with sentimental reflection, but with mission. The Lord speaks directly to Joshua, saying, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise." That phrase is extraordinary in its emotional economy. No prolonged transition, no endless ceremony. History moves, responsibility transfers. Grief and mission collide. This is often how leadership actually works. Institutions do not pause indefinitely for emotional adjustment. Crises continue. Decisions remain necessary. Joshua now faces the first impossible test of his leadership, crossing the Jordan River and leading Israel into the land previous generations had failed to enter. But before strategy comes identity. The repeated command in Joshua chapter 1 is unforgettable. Be strong and courageous. Again and again and again. Modern readers often treat these words as generic inspiration, but in context, they function almost diagnostically. Courage is emphasized because fear is real. Strength is commanded because weakness is possible. The repetition suggests Joshua genuinely needs reinforcement. That makes sense. Imagine the psychological burden. He is not simply replacing a respected predecessor, he is replacing Moses. Every decision risks comparison. Every hesitation could be interpreted as inadequacy. Every failure would be magnified by memory. Successor anxiety under legendary leadership is one of the most intense pressures imaginable. The text does not portray Joshua as immune to that pressure. It addresses it directly. Yet notice what divine reassurance emphasizes. Not Joshua's personal genius, not his military record. Presence. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. This is continuity language. Joshua is not asked to recreate Moses' identity. He is asked to lead within the same covenant relationship. That distinction matters profoundly. Healthy succession depends not on becoming the predecessor, but on faithfully inhabiting one's own role within enduring mission. Still, reassurance does not eliminate practical obstacles. The Jordan River now stands as both literal and symbolic barrier. Crossing water had defined the Exodus generation through the Red Sea. Now, Joshua's generation faces its own threshold crossing. The narrative intentionally creates thematic parallels, but also important differences. Moses led escaped slaves through chaotic deliverance from imperial pursuit. Joshua must lead a prepared people into intentional entry toward contested land. Similar symbolism, different mission. Historically, the Jordan River could be a significant obstacle, especially during seasonal overflow periods mentioned in the text. This is not merely stepping across a stream. For a large mobile population with families, supplies, tribal structures, and sacred objects, crossing such a barrier is logistically serious. Militarily, river crossings are notoriously vulnerable operations. Armies crossing water become exposed, fragmented, and strategically at risk. Any opposition during transition could be disastrous. Joshua's first command challenge is therefore not symbolic theater alone. It is operationally dangerous. The narrative's instructions center around the Ark of the Covenant, carried by priests moving ahead of the people. This imagery matters deeply. The Ark represents covenant presence, not magical military technology. Joshua's leadership is framed as dependent upon divine order, not merely tactical ingenuity. Yet practical leadership remains necessary. Officers move through the camp, instructions are communicated, the people are organized, sanctification is commanded, preparation is deliberate. Joshua is not passively waiting for events to unfold. He is actively leading within a theological framework. One of the most fascinating emotional layers here is public legitimacy. Joshua may have been officially commissioned, but official designation and lived trust are not always identical. A leader can inherit title without inheriting confidence. Joshua's first major public act, therefore, carries enormous symbolic importance. Can he actually lead the people through an impossible transition? Can the community trust him not merely as Moses' former assistant, but as their actual leader? Joshua chapter 3 answers through dramatic narrative confirmation. The waters are described as stopping as the priests bearing the ark step forward, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. The literary parallel to the Exodus is unmistakable. Theologically, the narrative presents continuity of divine faithfulness across generational transition. Joshua is not Moses, but the God of Moses remains active. That is the deeper message. Modern scholarly discussions naturally explore literary structure, theological intention, and historical questions surrounding the narrative form. But within the story's logic, the event functions as public legitimization. Joshua's leadership is visibly confirmed before the people. This is politically crucial. Great transitions require more than internal confidence. They require communal recognition. Another remarkable detail is memorialization. 12 stones are taken from the Jordan as a memorial sign. This is not random ritual decoration. Ancient identity depended heavily on embodied memory practices. Public monuments anchored collective narrative across generations. Joshua understands something essential about leadership. Events are not enough. Meaning must be preserved. Future children will ask what these stones mean. Leadership includes shaping memory, not merely managing logistics. This reveals Joshua's maturity immediately. He is not thinking only about immediate tactical success. He is thinking about long-term covenant identity. There is also a deeply personal layer beneath the public triumph. Joshua himself had once stood at the threshold of promise as one of the faithful spies. only to watch an entire generation retreat in fear. Now, decades later, he returns to a similar threshold, but under radically different conditions. The emotional weight must have been immense. Memory, vindication, grief, anticipation, responsibility, all converging at once. This is not merely a river crossing. It is the closure of 40 years of unfinished history. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Joshua's leadership here is balance. He does not overperform to prove himself. Some successors become dangerously theatrical under pressure, making reckless decisions to demonstrate strength. Joshua does not do that, nor does he retreat into hesitation. He acts decisively, but within ordered dependence. That is mature leadership. Courage without recklessness, faith without passivity, symbolism without administrative chaos. By the time the people stand across the Jordan, something profound has changed. Joshua is no longer merely the designated successor. He is the functioning leader who has carried Israel through its first impossible transition after Moses. The shadow remains, but it no longer defines him entirely. Leadership has moved from inherited expectation to demonstrated reality. Chapter 8 matters because this is where Joshua truly becomes Joshua. Not simply the former assistant, not merely the faithful spy, not just the appointed successor. Here, standing at the edge of fulfilled promise, he becomes the leader history will remember. Joshua had crossed the Jordan. His leadership had been publicly validated. The wilderness generation had finally entered the land their parents never reached. At this point, a conventional military story would accelerate into tactical campaigns, siege planning, troop formations, reconnaissance analysis, and battlefield execution. But Joshua's story refuses to behave like ordinary conquest history, because the first major city standing in Israel's path is Jericho, and everything about what happens there feels strategically strange, symbolically charged, and theologically deliberate. Jericho was no insignificant village in the biblical imagination. Positioned near the Jordan Valley, it represented a gateway into Canaan's interior. In narrative terms, it is the first major obstacle after entry. Psychologically, that matters. First battles shape confidence. Early defeats destabilize campaigns. Initial victories define morale. Joshua understands this. But before any walls fall, the story introduces an equally important subplot: Rahab. At Joshua's instruction, spies are sent into Jericho. This immediately creates an interesting narrative echo. Decades earlier, Joshua himself had been one of the spies sent into Canaan. That earlier mission had triggered national disaster because fear controlled interpretation. Now, Joshua sends reconnaissance again, but under radically different conditions. This is not paralysis-driven intelligence gathering. It is targeted operational preparation. That difference matters. Leadership learns from history. The spies encounter Rahab, a woman described in ways that have generated centuries of discussion, often translated as a prostitute or innkeeper, associated with a socially vulnerable or ambiguous position. Whatever the precise social reconstruction, her role in the narrative is extraordinary. She shelters the spies, deceives local authorities, and declares awareness that fear of Israel's God is already spread through the land. This is psychologically significant. Israel had once feared Canaanite strength. Now the narrative reverses the emotional lens. Jericho fears Israel, or more precisely, fears the God associated with Israel's story. Rahab becomes a narrative outsider who correctly interprets the moment while insiders in earlier generations failed to do so. This is a recurring biblical irony. Yet the Jericho story becomes even stranger before battle begins. Joshua encounters a mysterious figure described as commander of the army of the Lord. The scene is deliberately ambiguous, sacred, and unsettling. Joshua asks whether the figure is for Israel or its adversaries. The answer is striking. Neither. This moment matters because it reframes the entire campaign. Joshua is not placing God inside his military agenda. Joshua is being reminded that he operates inside a larger divine mission. That distinction is subtle but profound. Leaders often ask whether ultimate power is on their side. The narrative shifts the question toward whether the leader is aligned with divine purpose. Joshua removes his sandals in a scene echoing Moses at the burning bush. Symbolically, continuity is unmistakable. The conquest story is being framed not as raw expansionism, but as covenant history within theological interpretation. Then comes the military plan, if we can even call it that in conventional terms. Jericho is shut tightly, fortified, defended. Ancient walled cities were formidable obstacles. Siege warfare in the ancient Near East was brutal, slow, resource-intensive, and strategically difficult. Cities depended on fortifications, precisely because open battle was not always necessary. Hold the walls, control access, survive pressure. That was standard logic. So, what does Joshua receive as strategy? March. Circle the city once daily for 6 days, with priests bearing trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, circle 7 times, blow trumpets, and shout. From a purely conventional military standpoint, this sounds bizarre. No scaling ladders, no siege engines, no tunneling detail, no visible assault formations, no tactical explanation recognizable to standard warfare manuals. Which is exactly the point. The narrative is intentionally strange. Some modern readers either over-rationalize the event into hidden military realism or dismiss it as implausible symbolism. But within the text's own literary logic, the unusual method is the message. Jericho is not framed as an ordinary victory. It is covenant theater, ritual movement, sacred presence, repeated procession, silence, sound, timing, all create liturgical war imagery rather than standard tactical description. This does not necessarily erase historical questions scholars debate regarding archaeology, chronology, literary shaping, and conquest traditions. Those debates are real and complex. But inside the narrative itself, Jericho functions as theological demonstration. Victory comes not through visible conventional superiority, but through obedience within sacred command. Joshua's leadership role here is fascinating. He must communicate and enforce a strategy that likely sounded profoundly irrational to ordinary observers. Imagine explaining this to soldiers. March around the walls, remain silent, repeat for days, then shout. Great leaders sometimes face the challenge of implementing plans whose logic is not immediately obvious to followers. Joshua's authority is being tested not merely through battlefield courage, but through disciplined obedience under strategic ambiguity. The people comply. That itself reflects his growing legitimacy. There is another psychological dimension often overlooked. Repetitive marching around a fortified city may have affected defenders as much as attackers. Ancient warfare involved morale, symbolism, intimidation, uncertainty, and psychological disruption. Strange ritual behavior can destabilize expectations. Defenders expecting conventional assault may be unsettled by unexplained, repetitive processions involving sacred objects and collective silence. While the narrative's emphasis is theological, psychological warfare dynamics are not impossible considerations. Then, the climax. The walls fall in the narrative account. Jericho is taken, and the city becomes associated with judgment and consecrated destruction language that modern audiences understandably find morally difficult. These texts require serious interpretive care. Ancient warfare rhetoric often employed hyperbolic, totalizing language, and scholars debate genre, historical referent, literary shaping, and theological framing extensively. What is clear is that the biblical narrative presents Jericho not as random aggression, but as part of covenant judgment logic within its own theological worldview. That does not remove interpretive challenges, but it clarifies narrative intent. Rahab and her household are spared, fulfilling the prior commitment made by the spies. This detail is deeply important. Even within a judgment narrative, covenant, fidelity, and mercy remain themes. Joshua's leadership is shown as bound by oath, not arbitrary violence. Another remarkable consequence follows. Joshua's fame spreads throughout the land. Public legitimacy expands. The new leader has not merely crossed the river, he has now presided over the first iconic victory in Canaan. Yet the victory's nature prevents simplistic hero worship. Joshua is central, but not narratively autonomous. The ark remains central. Divine instruction remains central. Sacred symbolism remains central. This is consistent with the book's larger theological architecture. Leaders matter, but covenant presence defines outcomes. Perhaps the strangest and most profound lesson of Jericho is this. Joshua's first major conquest does not primarily reward military innovation. It rewards obedience under uncertainty. For a man shaped by slavery, battle, wilderness patience, and long mentorship, that lesson fits perfectly. Leadership is not merely about mastering force. It is about knowing when force is not the primary story. Chapter 9 matters because Jericho transforms Joshua from a leader who inherited legitimacy into a leader associated with decisive victory. But it also warns viewers not to misunderstand the kind of leader he is. Joshua is not being presented as a conventional empire builder. He is being presented as a covenant commander, operating inside a theological drama far larger than himself. After Jericho, the emotional atmosphere must have felt electric. The impossible had happened. The Jordan had opened. The first major fortified city had fallen in astonishing fashion. Joshua's leadership had been validated publicly, militarily, and theologically. Momentum appeared unstoppable. And that is precisely what makes Chapter 10 so devastating, because some of the most dangerous moments in leadership do not come during weakness. They come immediately after success. Victory creates confidence, but confidence can quietly become presumption. Jericho had established a powerful narrative. God was with Joshua, Israel was advancing, enemies were vulnerable, momentum was building. The next target, Ai, appeared strategically insignificant by comparison, smaller, less intimidating, more manageable. From a conventional military perspective, this should have been straightforward, which is exactly why the disaster becomes so shocking. Joshua 7 opens with ominous clarity. But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. That sentence changes everything before the military action even begins. The narrative informs the audience of a problem Joshua does not yet know exists. This creates dramatic tension. Jericho's victory had included strict instructions regarding certain consecrated items, framed within the text as devoted to the Lord rather than available for personal appropriation. Achan from the tribe of Judah secretly violates that command, taking valuables for himself. From a modern individualistic perspective, readers often immediately ask why one person's hidden act should affect the broader community. That discomfort is understandable. But ancient covenant thinking often operated with stronger corporate identity assumptions than modern Western individualism. Families, tribes, and communities were understood relationally, not merely atomistically. The narrative's theological logic treats covenant violation as communal contamination, not isolated private misconduct. Whether modern readers agree with that framework is a separate interpretive question, but understanding the text requires recognizing its worldview. Meanwhile, Joshua proceeds operationally. Spies assess Ai and return with confident recommendations. The force needed appears minimal. No full-scale mobilization seems necessary. This is a critical leadership moment because it reveals how success shapes decision-making. Jericho required extraordinary dependence and sacred instruction. Ai looks manageable through conventional assessment. There is no dramatic ritual build-up here, no elaborate divine strategy narrative at first. The contrast feels intentional. Confidence has shifted. Then catastrophe. The Israelites are routed. Men die. Survivors flee. Fear spreads instantly. Joshua 7 says the hearts of the people melted and became like water. That phrase should sound familiar. Earlier, fear belonged to Canaanite populations hearing about Israel. Now the emotional reversal is complete. Israel becomes the frightened party. Psychological momentum collapses with terrifying speed. This is how fragile military confidence can be. One defeat can undo the emotional capital built by prior victories. For Joshua, personally, the moment is crushing. His reaction is raw and revealing. He tears his clothes, falls before the ark, and laments before God. The emotional tone matters. This is not detached strategic recalibration. This is anguish. Joshua asks why Israel crossed the Jordan only to suffer defeat. He fears the political consequences, the encouragement this will give enemies, and the damage to divine reputation among surrounding peoples. This reaction tells us something important. Joshua is not emotionally invulnerable. Even seasoned leaders can be shaken when reality violently contradicts expectations. But the crisis also exposes a leadership blind spot. Joshua assumed the battlefield problem was external. The actual problem was internal. This echoes his earlier misreading at Sinai, when he interpreted chaotic sounds as war rather than covenant breakdown. Once again, Joshua must learn that not every crisis originates from enemy action. Some defeats emerge from internal disorder. God's response in the narrative is strikingly direct. Israel has sinned. The defeat is framed not as tactical misfortune, but covenant breach. This is not the kind of explanation modern secular military analysis would offer, but within the theological architecture of Joshua, it is decisive. The issue is not troop numbers or battlefield incompetence. The issue is covenant violation undermining communal standing. That worldview defines the narrative logic. What follows is one of the most sobering accountability processes in the book. Through a structured identification process, Achan is exposed. He confesses taking a beautiful Babylonian garment, silver and gold. The specificity is psychologically realistic. Temptation is often concrete, tangible, ordinary, not abstract villainy. Wealth, desire, opportunity, concealment. The human pattern is recognizable across centuries. The moral complexity of the aftermath is difficult and has generated significant interpretive debate, particularly regarding communal punishment themes and ancient judgment frameworks. These are serious issues that deserve thoughtful engagement rather than simplistic treatment. Within the narrative's own covenant worldview, however, the event functions as a dramatic restoration of communal integrity through judgment. For Joshua, as a leader, the lesson is severe. Leadership does not merely involve defeating enemies. It requires confronting corruption inside the community. And that is often harder. External enemies can unify a population. Internal wrongdoing fractures trust, complicates justice, and destabilizes morale. Military competence alone cannot solve moral disorder. Joshua is learning the broader scope of leadership painfully. The subsequent campaign against Ai unfolds differently. This time, divine guidance is explicit. Strategy becomes more conventionally tactical, involving ambush elements and coordinated deception rather than Jericho's ritual procession structure. This contrast matters. Joshua's leadership is not locked into one formula. Covenant dependence does not eliminate strategic adaptation. Jericho and Ai are intentionally different, suggesting leadership requires discernment, not ritualized repetition. The second campaign succeeds. Ai falls. Momentum is restored. But Joshua is not the same leader who approached the first attempt. Failure has recalibrated him. This chapter is essential because it destroys triumphalist illusions. It would be easy to imagine Joshua's post-Jordan story as uninterrupted conquest driven by divine favor and military momentum. Joshua 7 refuses that simplistic narrative. Faithful leaders can face shocking defeat. Internal corruption can undermine external strength. Public legitimacy does not prevent painful mistakes. One particularly important observation is Joshua's response to crisis. He does not deny the defeat. He does not manipulate perception. He does not invent false victories. He confronts the disaster emotionally and publicly. That matters. Failed leaders often protect ego through denial. Joshua moves toward the crisis, even in confusion. That is a meaningful leadership trait. Another layer here is theological maturation. Jericho could have created the illusion that covenant leadership meant automatic, visible victory. AI destroys that illusion. Leadership under God, as Joshua's narrative presents it, includes accountability, correction, failure, and recalibration. That produces a more serious, less romantic leader. By the end of this chapter, Joshua understands something critical. The greatest threat to Israel's mission may not always be fortified cities. Sometimes it is hidden compromise among the people themselves. Sometimes the most dangerous battlefield is moral, not geographical. Chapter 10 matters because it humanizes Joshua's leadership through failure. He is not a flawless conquest machine moving from miracle to miracle. He is a real leader, learning painful lessons about responsibility, community integrity, and the devastating cost of internal disorder. Jericho made him famous. Ai made him wiser. By chapter 10, Joshua had learned that leadership could be broken not only by enemies, but by hidden corruption within his own people. By chapter 11, he learns a different and equally dangerous lesson. Not every threat comes through open confrontation. Some arrive smiling, exhausted, apparently harmless, carrying the appearance of peace. If Jericho tested obedience and Ai tested internal accountability, Gibeon tests discernment. And unlike previous crises, this one cannot be solved through battlefield courage alone. Because this time, Joshua is not defeated by superior force. He is outmaneuvered politically. Joshua 9 opens in the aftermath of Israel's growing success. Regional kings hear what has happened at Jericho and Ai, and the geopolitical atmosphere changes immediately. This is historically realistic. Ancient Near Eastern politics were highly sensitive to shifts in military power. Emerging threats triggered coalition responses, defensive realignments, and strategic calculations. City-states rarely watched passively while a new force altered regional balance. The biblical narrative reflects this logic. Most local rulers prepare for confrontation. But the inhabitants of Gibeon choose something more sophisticated: deception. Their strategy is brilliantly simple. Rather than approach as nearby inhabitants subject to Israel's campaign realities, they disguise themselves as travelers from a distant land. Worn sacks, cracked wineskins, old sandals, dry, moldy provisions. Every visual cue is carefully curated. This is psychological theater, and it works. The Gibeonites understand something crucial about human judgment. People trust visible evidence when it confirms a plausible story. That dynamic has not changed much across history. A believable narrative paired with compelling physical signals often bypasses deeper scrutiny. Joshua and Israel's leaders fall directly into that trap. The visitors present their case diplomatically. They emphasize Israel's growing reputation, reference what they have heard about Israel's God, and request covenant terms. The conversation becomes politically delicate almost immediately. Israel's leaders raise a reasonable concern. What if you actually live nearby? That question shows some awareness. The problem is not total naivety. The problem is insufficient verification. The Gibeonites double down on their performance, and the narrative delivers one of the most quietly devastating lines in the book. The leaders took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. That sentence explains everything. The military genius of Jericho, the painful lesson of Ai, the growing maturity of Joshua. And yet here, discernment fails in a different domain. Not because of hidden theft, not because of battlefield weakness, because decision-making proceeds without deeper consultation. The narrative's theological critique is sharp. Leadership competence does not eliminate vulnerability. Even seasoned leaders can make avoidable errors when visible evidence appears convincing. Joshua makes peace with them and establishes a covenant oath. From a political standpoint, this is no small administrative detail. Ancient treaty-making was serious business. Oaths invoked sacred accountability. Agreements shaped military obligations, labor structures, and diplomatic realities. Once the treaty is made, discovery comes quickly. The Gibeonites are not distant foreigners. They are local inhabitants. Joshua has been deceived. This moment is deeply important for his character because it reveals a rare but essential dimension of leadership credibility. Can a respected leader survive public embarrassment? Joshua absolutely has reason to feel humiliated. He has been manipulated. His judgment has failed. The leadership team has been fooled, and the consequences are not theoretical. The political cost is immediate. Israel's community grumbles against the leaders. Trust is strained. A less mature leader might respond with denial, rage-driven overcorrection, or treaty violation disguised as damage control. Joshua does something more difficult. He honors the oath. This decision is ethically and politically fascinating. From one perspective, the agreement was obtained deceptively. Modern legal reasoning might immediately explore fraud in validation. But the biblical narrative places enormous weight on oath integrity. The leaders conclude that breaking the sworn covenant would create a different moral crisis. In other words, Joshua's mistake does not justify faithlessness in response. This is remarkable leadership logic. A poor decision has created constraints, but integrity still matters inside those constraints. The Gibeonites are not released without consequence. They are assigned service roles associated with labor for the community and sanctuary functions. This arrangement reflects ancient hierarchical realities, not modern egalitarian assumptions. But the larger narrative point remains. Joshua chooses covenant integrity over face-saving revenge. That decision reveals maturity. There is also extraordinary political realism here. Diplomacy is often messier than warfare. Battle clarifies enemies. Diplomacy introduces ambiguity, negotiation, deception, obligation, and long-term unintended consequences. Joshua, who has proven military competence repeatedly, now learns the brutal complexity of political leadership. Conquering land is one challenge. Governing relationships is another entirely. Historically, deception in ancient diplomacy was not unusual. Treaties, envoys, strategic misdirection, and political opportunism were common features of the ancient world. The Gibeonite strategy is historically plausible precisely because weaker powers often survived through intelligence rather than force. They correctly assess Israel's growing momentum and conclude that direct confrontation would be catastrophic. Their deception is morally ambiguous, but strategically rational. The narrative does not celebrate their dishonesty simplistically, yet neither does it portray them as irrational villains. They are political actors trying to survive. This complexity enriches the story. Another important layer is Joshua's growth. Compare this moment with earlier chapters. At Jericho, obedience under explicit divine instruction dominates. At Ai, failure exposes internal corruption. At Gibeon, the challenge is judgment under incomplete information. These are different leadership competencies. Joshua's story is intentionally broadening. Great leadership is not one-dimensional. Courage alone is insufficient. Integrity alone is insufficient. Tactical skill alone is insufficient. Discernment across changing contexts is required. Joshua's failure here is therefore not character collapse, but developmental realism. Strong leaders still make costly errors. The real question is what happens next. And what happens next becomes even more dramatic, because the Gibeonite treaty immediately drags Israel into regional military conflict. Neighboring kings interpret Gibeon's alliance with Israel as betrayal and mobilize against them. Joshua's diplomatic mistake now creates military obligation. This is how leadership decisions compound. A rushed agreement becomes a war trigger. Yet Joshua does not abandon the people he has sworn to protect, even though their presence originated through deception. That consistency matters. Leadership integrity means honoring commitments even when they become expensive. Theologically, this chapter offers a sobering message. Leaders can be deeply faithful and still misjudge situations when they rely too heavily on appearances. Spiritual maturity does not remove the need for discernment. Institutional success does not guarantee wise decision-making. Past victories do not immunize against present mistakes. Perhaps that is why the Gibeon story remains so compelling. It feels painfully recognizable. Many failures in leadership history have not come from obvious evil or cowardice, but from plausible assumptions insufficiently examined. Joshua emerges from this chapter more complicated, more human, and arguably more credible. Because perfect leaders are mythological. Real leaders make mistakes, then reveal their character and how they respond. Chapter 11 matters because it shifts Joshua's story beyond conquest into governance. He is no longer merely defeating enemies. He is navigating diplomacy, public trust, legal obligation, and political fallout. The warrior is becoming a statesman, and the transition is anything but easy. By chapter 11, Joshua had already proven that leadership in Canaan would be far more complicated than a simple sequence of miraculous victories. Jericho had demonstrated theological symbolism. Ai had exposed internal vulnerability. Gibeon had revealed diplomatic complexity. But now the scale expands dramatically. Joshua is no longer dealing with isolated cities or contained crises. He is entering regional warfare. Coalitions form, political systems react, strategic geography matters. And this is where the story of Joshua becomes one of the most discussed and debated sections in biblical history, not only theologically, but historically and archaeologically as well. The immediate trigger comes from the Gibeonite alliance. 5 Amorite kings from the southern region interpret Gibeon's treaty with Israel as a direct geopolitical threat. This is entirely plausible in ancient power dynamics. Smaller city-states often survived through shifting alliances, and the defection of a strategically relevant city could destabilize regional balances quickly. To surrounding rulers, Gibeon's agreement with Israel was not merely a diplomatic inconvenience, it was potential strategic disaster. So they do what threatened powers often do. They form a coalition. Their target is Gibeon. This places Joshua in a politically binding position created by his earlier treaty mistake. He must now defend the very people who deceived him. That detail is crucial because it demonstrates continuity of leadership integrity. Joshua does not reinterpret obligation when it becomes costly. He marches, and the narrative emphasizes speed. An overnight movement from Gilgal to support Gibeon suggests urgency, operational discipline, and strategic responsiveness. Whatever theological dimensions frame the story, Joshua is clearly not portrayed as passive. He acts decisively under pressure. The battle narrative includes one of the most famous and debated episodes in the entire Hebrew Bible, the account involving the sun standing still. Interpreters across centuries have approached this text in dramatically different ways. Literal miracle, poetic war language, ancient cosmological expression, literary theological symbolism, or some hybrid interpretive framework. Serious scholarship does not treat the interpretive questions lightly. The text itself references the Book of Jashar, suggesting poetic source material may be embedded in the narrative tradition. Whatever interpretive position one takes, within the biblical story's logic, the point is unmistakable. Extraordinary divine intervention is associated with Joshua's military campaign. The narrative frames victory not merely as human operational success, but as participation in a larger theological conflict. This chapter requires interpretive care because modern readers often approach conquest narratives with strong assumptions, either devotional certainty or skeptical dismissal. But the most responsible analysis recognizes literary intention, theological framing, ancient war rhetoric, and historical complexity simultaneously. The biblical text presents decisive victories over southern coalitions, yet historians and archaeologists debate how conquest traditions map onto material evidence, chronology, and the realities of late Bronze Age Canaan. Some models suggest sweeping, rapid conquest. Others argue for gradual infiltration, regional emergence, literary compression, or complex, mixed settlement processes. The academic conversation is substantial. But inside Joshua's narrative architecture, the Southern campaign functions as escalation of legitimacy. Joshua is no longer proving himself locally. He is operating regionally. The psychological impact would have been enormous. Victory at Jericho is one thing. Facing a coalition of kings is another entirely. Leadership pressure scales with threat scale, and yet Joshua appears increasingly confident in command. This does not mean simplistic invincibility. It means maturation. The hesitant successor of earlier chapters is now functioning as an experienced wartime leader. The Southern campaign also highlights geography. Canaan was not a single unified nation-state in the modern sense. It was a mosaic of urban centers, local rulers, regional alliances, and varied terrain. Hill country, valleys, fortified sites, trade routes, water access, all shaped military possibilities. Understanding Joshua requires abandoning simplistic maps of monolithic enemy territory. Ancient conflict was fragmented, localized, and politically fluid. The biblical narrative reflects that complexity more than casual reading sometimes realize. Then the Northern Coalition emerges. If the Southern Alliance was serious, the Northern response appears even larger. Joshua 11 describes a formidable coalition under Jabin, king of Hazor, with horses and chariots, language signaling significant military capability. Hazor itself is especially noteworthy historically. Archaeologically, it was one of the major urban centers of ancient Canaan, making its appearance in the narrative strategically significant. If one were imagining plausible regional resistance, Hazor belongs in the conversation. The Northern Coalition suggests that Joshua's growing influence had become impossible to ignore. Regional powers now respond at scale. The mention of horses and chariots also matters. Ancient chariot warfare represented technological and tactical advantage in many contexts. For populations without equivalent systems, such forces could appear intimidating. Remember the psychology here. Israel's ancestral memory included fear of powerful military systems from Egypt onward. Chariots symbolized overwhelming force. The narrative's inclusion of them is not accidental. It magnifies the perceived challenge. Yet again, the text frames Joshua's response through divine reassurance and decisive action. A sudden assault is described. The coalition is defeated. Hazor is specifically destroyed in the narrative account, a detail that has attracted enormous scholarly attention because archaeological destruction layers at Hazor have been interpreted in various ways, though chronological alignment remains debated. This is exactly where simplistic certainty becomes unhelpful. The biblical text makes strong claims within its literary theological framework. Archaeological interpretation operates with methodological caution, incomplete evidence, and ongoing debate. Serious analysis acknowledges both without collapsing either into caricature. One of the most important interpretive issues in Joshua is conquest language itself. Ancient Near Eastern military texts often employed totalizing rhetoric. Kings claimed comprehensive destruction, complete victory, or absolute domination in formulaic ways that did not always correspond to modern literalistic reporting expectations. This matters because Joshua contains both sweeping victory claims and later acknowledgments that not all territories were fully subdued immediately. That tension has generated extensive scholarly discussion. Some argue the conquest language reflects conventional ancient hyperbole rather than precise, exhaustive demographic reporting. Others interpret differently. The key point for responsible storytelling is recognizing genre awareness. Ancient war narratives are not modern military after-action reports. So what does this mean for Joshua as a character? It means his leadership is now operating on the largest stage of his life. He is commanding in coalition warfare, responding to evolving threats, and functioning as the recognized central military figure of Israel's expansion narrative. But something equally important is happening beneath the battles. Joshua is becoming more than a successor who inherited Moses' authority. He is becoming a historically distinct leader with his own legacy profile. Moses was deliverer and law mediator. Joshua is remembered as conqueror and territorial leader. Different roles, different eras, same covenant story. Yet the narrative carefully preserves theological framing. Joshua's success is never meant to be read as autonomous empire building. The text repeatedly emphasizes divine involvement, covenant continuity, and mission identity. That framing is essential, whether one reads devotionally, historically, or critically. Chapter 12 matters because this is where Joshua reaches the apex of his wartime leadership image. No longer merely surviving crises, he is directing campaigns that reshape the political map of the narrative world. But this is also where modern interpretive maturity matters most. Joshua's campaigns sit at the intersection of theology, history, archaeology, literary convention, and ethical reflection. Simplistic readings flatten the complexity. The complete story demands more seriousness. And Joshua himself now stands, not merely as Moses' successor, but as the commanding figure of Israel's conquest era. After years of battles, shifting alliances, military campaigns, political crises, and extraordinary moments of both triumph and failure, the story of Joshua takes a dramatic turn. And at first glance, modern audiences often misread this turn as a slowdown. The battles become less central. The narrative fills with borders, tribal allocations, territorial descriptions, inheritance details, and administrative distribution. To many casual readers, this can feel like the least cinematic section of Joshua's story. But in reality, this chapter may be one of the most politically significant moments in his entire leadership. Because conquering territory is only half the challenge. Governing it is harder. Taking land creates headlines. Organizing a nation creates history. Joshua's transformation in this chapter is profound. He is no longer primarily acting as wartime commander. He is becoming a nation builder. Joshua 13 opens with a striking statement. Joshua is old, advanced in years. That detail matters immediately. Time has passed. The relentless campaign years have aged him. The man who once stood as the young military aide beneath Moses is now an elder statesman facing unfinished realities. And the text makes something clear that often surprises readers. Not all the land has been fully possessed. This is a critical narrative detail, because it complicates simplistic conquest assumptions. Earlier chapters contained sweeping victory language, yet now the text openly acknowledges remaining territories. This tension has been central to both theological interpretation and academic analysis. Some see complementary perspectives, distinguishing major military dominance from incomplete local occupation. Others point to ancient literary conventions involving summary victory rhetoric alongside practical territorial complexity. Either way, the biblical narrative itself does not present a cartoonishly simple picture of total, instant occupation. Reality is more layered, yet despite unfinished work, allocation begins. Why? Because leadership is not merely about waiting for perfect completion before establishing structure. Political organization must proceed amid ongoing complexity. That is historically realistic. Emerging societies rarely wait for absolute territorial certainty before governance arrangements begin. Borders, inheritance rights, strategic responsibilities, and communal identity need definition. Joshua now presides over one of the most consequential administrative acts in Israel's foundational memory: land distribution. Modern readers can underestimate how explosive this issue would have been. Land in the ancient world was not merely real estate. It was economic survival, political identity, tribal continuity, military positioning, agricultural future, inheritance security, and covenant symbolism. Control over land meant life. Mismanaging distribution could fracture the entire national project. Tribal resentment, accusations of favoritism, boundary disputes, strategic imbalance, and long-term instability could all emerge from poor allocation. Joshua is not handling paperwork. He is managing the structural future of a nation. The process itself is politically sophisticated. Tribal inheritances are allocated according to prior frameworks tied to ancestral identity. This reinforces continuity with older covenant promises rather than arbitrary administrative invention. Joshua is not behaving like an imperial monarch, distributing rewards based on personal loyalty. He is functioning within inherited covenant structures. That distinction matters enormously. His authority is real, but bounded by larger identity commitments. Caleb's appearance in this section is especially meaningful. Caleb, Joshua's fellow faithful spy from the Kadesh crisis, requests the hill country associated with earlier promise. The moment is emotionally rich. Decades earlier, Caleb and Joshua stood almost alone against national fear. Now, in old age, that long-delayed faith receives territorial realization. Caleb's confidence remains striking. He still describes himself as ready for conflict, despite advanced years. The scene reinforces continuity between wilderness faithfulness and present fulfillment. It also reminds viewers that Joshua's story has always been shared, at least in part, with other faithful survivors. Nation-building is not solitary mythology. Another crucial aspect is the role of the Levites. Unlike other tribes, they do not receive conventional territorial inheritance in the same way. Their inheritance is framed differently, associated with sacred service and provision structures. This reflects a distinctive social architecture. Ancient Israel's identity, as presented in the biblical narrative, is not purely territorial or military. Worship structures remain central. Joshua's governance therefore includes protecting not only political order, but covenant religious identity. A nation can secure borders and still lose its soul. The distribution model attempts to prevent that. Geographically, the allocations matter tremendously. Hill country, valleys, river access, agricultural zones, defensive terrain, trade routes, all shape future realities. Territorial placement is never neutral. Some tribes receive strategically advantageous regions. Others face harder circumstances. Historical governance always involves geography, because geography shapes economics, defense, and political leverage. Joshua's role, therefore, includes managing spatial power distribution. This is sophisticated leadership. There is also an understated psychological shift happening here. Military leadership often operates around urgency, external threat, and visible action. Administrative leadership demands patience, precision, negotiation, documentation, and conflict prevention. Not every successful commander transitions well into governance. History offers countless examples of wartime leaders failing as administrators. Joshua's narrative suggests surprising adaptability. He does not appear trapped in conquest mentality. He can transition from battlefield command to structural institution building. That is rare leadership versatility. Theologically, land allocation carries enormous symbolic meaning. The promise to Abraham was never merely abstract spiritual encouragement. It included concrete territorial identity within biblical covenant memory. Distribution, therefore, represents fulfillment, at least in meaningful partial form. The promise is taking shape geographically. Yet the text's honesty about unfinished realities preserves realism. Fulfillment is genuine, but not simplistic. promise does not erase complexity overnight. This is one reason Joshua remains such an interesting leadership figure. His story resists triumphalist oversimplification. Another often overlooked element is the use of lot casting in portions of the allocation process. Modern readers may find this strange, but within ancient covenant frameworks it functioned as a recognized mechanism for seeking fair distribution under divine sovereignty assumptions. It helped reduce perceptions of arbitrary personal favoritism. Politically, that is smart. Leadership legitimacy depends partly on process credibility. If Joshua appeared to distribute land according to personal bias, tribal conflict could explode. Structured mechanisms matter. The chapter also quietly raises the question of succession beyond Joshua himself. He is aging. The distribution project is not merely about present stability, but future continuity. Institutions must outlast personalities. This is one of the defining tests of mature leadership. Can a leader build systems that survive his absence? Joshua appears increasingly focused on exactly that. His greatness is no longer measured primarily in battle victories, but in structural legacy. Historically, this reflects a critical transition in state formation logic. Conquest narratives alone do not create enduring societies. Territorial organization, identity frameworks, legal inheritance, and institutional coherence do. Joshua's story, as framed in Scripture, recognizes that reality. Whether read devotionally or historically, the administrative material matters because it reflects movement from campaign to settlement, from mobility to rootedness, from warfare to ordered communal life. Chapter 13 matters because it reveals the fullest evolution of Joshua's leadership. The former slave became a warrior. The warrior became a successor. The successor became a conqueror. Now the conqueror becomes an architect of national order. That transformation is extraordinary, because in the end, the leaders who shape history most deeply are often not merely those who win wars, but those who build structures capable of surviving after the wars are over. By chapter 13, Joshua had largely completed one of the most politically complex transitions in Israel's history. The wandering nation had become a settled people. Territories had been distributed. Tribal inheritances had been established. The conquest era, at least in its major narrative arc, appeared to be stabilizing. For modern audiences, this feels like the moment the story should exhale. The wars are mostly over. The institutions are forming. The promise has tangible shape. But history rarely behaves so neatly, because some of the most dangerous threats to a nation emerge not from external enemies, but from internal misunderstanding. And in chapter 14, Joshua faces perhaps one of the most politically terrifying scenarios of his entire leadership: the possibility of civil war. Joshua 22 presents the crisis in a way that initially feels almost administrative. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, those whose inheritance had been assigned east of the Jordan, are finally released after fulfilling their military obligations alongside the western tribes. This detail matters. These eastern tribes had not abandoned the collective mission. They had fought faithfully with the broader Israelite coalition despite receiving land outside the core western territorial zone. Joshua publicly commends their obedience, loyalty, and covenant faithfulness before sending them home with blessing. At this stage, everything appears orderly. But then comes the incident that nearly tears the nation apart. On their return, the eastern tribes build a large altar near the Jordan. And immediately, panic erupts. To modern readers, this may seem like an overreaction. An altar? Why would that provoke near war? But within Israel's covenant framework, this is no minor symbolic gesture. Worship centralization, covenant identity, and proper sacred practice carried existential significance. The memory of earlier covenant failures remained painfully alive: Golden Calf Rebellion, Peor apostasy, Achan's covenant violation. Israel had repeatedly learned that spiritual compromise could trigger catastrophic consequences for the whole community. So when news spreads that a massive altar has been erected, the Western tribes do not interpret it neutrally. They interpret it as rebellion. The reaction is immediate and severe. The entire congregation assembles at Shiloh to make war. That response tells us how volatile the symbolic landscape had become. This is not irrational panic in narrative terms. It is trauma-informed political reaction. The community has internalized a worldview in which covenant deviation can endanger everyone. What makes this chapter extraordinary is how quickly a perception escalates toward violence. No foreign army invades, no external coalition forms, no battlefield defeat triggers fear. A misunderstood symbolic act almost destroys the nation from within. Historically, this is profoundly realistic. Internal fragmentation has ended more political communities than external invasion. Shared enemies often unify. Ambiguous identity disputes divide. Geography makes the problem worse. The Jordan is not merely a river. It can become a psychological boundary. The eastern tribes are geographically separated from the western majority. Over time, distance can breed suspicion. Peripheral groups may fear exclusion. Central groups may question loyalty. Border geography often amplifies identity anxiety. The altar becomes a flashpoint because it touches exactly those nerves. Yet what follows reveals one of the most mature moments in Joshua-era leadership. Instead of immediate military assault, a delegation is sent, led by Phinehas. This matters enormously. Diplomacy precedes violence. Confrontation happens, but through investigation. That alone may have saved the nation. The delegation's accusations are intense. They explicitly connect the altar with past acts of rebellion and warn that such disloyalty could bring judgment on the entire people. The emotional tone is severe because the stakes feel existential. But notice something important. Even in accusation, the Western tribes offer reintegration. If the Eastern land is somehow unsuitable, they can cross over and share inheritance westward. This is not merely threat. It is fearful concern mixed with attempted preservation of unity. Then comes the revelation that changes everything. The Eastern tribes explain that the altar was not built for sacrificial competition or covenant rebellion. It was built as a witness. A memorial testimony that, despite geographic separation, they remained part of Israel's covenant identity. Their fear was not theological independence. Their fear was future exclusion. They worried later generations west of the Jordan might say, "You have no share in the Lord." This explanation is politically brilliant and emotionally revealing. The same symbolic act interpreted as rebellion was actually motivated by anxiety about belonging. That is one of the most human dynamics in history. Groups fearing exclusion often create symbols of identity assertion, while outsiders interpret those same symbols as acts of separation. Misunderstanding becomes combustible. Joshua's larger leadership legacy matters here, even though he is not the most verbally central figure in every exchange. The structures of covenant seriousness, national unity, and disciplined response have been shaped under his era. This is not chaotic tribal collapse. It is crisis management within an identity framework. The delegation accepts the explanation. War is avoided. National fracture is prevented. But the near disaster leaves an enduring lesson. Shared history does not eliminate the risk of division. Even people who fought side by side can begin to distrust one another when symbolism becomes ambiguous. Theologically, this chapter underscores the centrality of covenant unity. Israel's identity was never meant to fragment into isolated tribal religious systems. The alarm over the altar reflects that concern. Yet equally important is the recognition that zeal without understanding can become destructive. Sincere commitment to truth does not guarantee correct interpretation. This tension makes the chapter extraordinarily relevant beyond its ancient setting. Historically, internal conflicts triggered by symbolic misunderstanding are common across civilizations. Religious markers, monuments, territorial boundaries, ritual practices, and public gestures often become catalysts for political escalation. The altar crisis feels ancient, but the underlying human dynamics are timeless. Another fascinating aspect is what this chapter reveals about Joshua's success as a leader. It would be easy to evaluate him primarily by battles won and territories assigned, but preserving internal cohesion may be the harder achievement. External conquest is dramatic. Internal unity is fragile. Leaders can defeat enemies and still fail to prevent civil fragmentation. Joshua's era nearly experiences that nightmare, but pulls back in time. That matters enormously. There is also irony here. Joshua's greatest campaigns involved defeating fortified cities and military coalitions. Yet one of the gravest dangers emerged from misunderstanding among allies. This is a sobering leadership truth. The strongest organizations are not always destroyed by opponents. Sometimes they are nearly destroyed by miscommunication among insiders. By this point in the story, Joshua is no longer simply a conquest hero. He is the steward of national coherence. His leadership world has evolved from battlefield command to identity preservation. That transition reflects mature political reality. Founding a nation is one challenge. Keeping it together is another. Chapter 14 matters because it strips away simplistic assumptions about victory. Entering the land did not solve every problem. Shared covenant did not eliminate suspicion. Geographic settlement did not guarantee unity. The crisis of the altar reminds us that nations can stand strongest against outsiders while remaining dangerously vulnerable to internal fracture. And Joshua's legacy now includes not just conquest and administration, but survival through near civil collapse. Every great leader eventually arrives at a moment when conquest, administration, and crisis management are no longer the central question. The question becomes legacy. Not what battles were won, not what territories were assigned, not what political disasters were avoided, but what kind of people will remain when the leader is gone. Chapter 15 brings Joshua to exactly that moment. And in a profound narrative shift, the warrior who once led military campaigns now stands as an elder statesman confronting the deeper issue that has haunted Israel from the very beginning: covenant faithfulness. Because Joshua understands something history repeatedly confirms. External victories can create nations, but only internal loyalty sustains them. Joshua 23 and 24 preserve Joshua's farewell framework, culminating in one of the most famous declarations in the entire Hebrew Bible. But reducing these chapters to inspirational quotations misses their extraordinary political, theological, and historical depth. This is not sentimental retirement commentary. It is covenant statecraft. Joshua is old now, explicitly advanced in years. The phrase matters because the narrative wants readers to feel historical closure. The generation of transition is ending. The man who once served Moses, crossed the Jordan, faced Jericho, survived internal crises, and oversaw national formation, is nearing death. And he knows it. Leaders often reveal their clearest priorities when time is short. Joshua's priorities are revealing. He does not deliver a self-celebratory memoir. He does not recount military brilliance to secure personal legacy. He does not construct dynastic succession rhetoric around family ambition. Instead, he calls the nation to covenant remembrance and decision. That tells us everything about how the narrative wants Joshua remembered. The first farewell speech emphasizes historical reflection. Joshua reminds the leaders what has happened: victories achieved, lands allotted, enemies displaced, divine faithfulness demonstrated. But the historical review is not nostalgia for its own sake. Memory serves moral purpose. Ancient covenant identity depended heavily on collective memory. Forgetting origins was politically and spiritually dangerous. Nations that forget why they exist often lose coherence quickly. Joshua understands that. Memory is strategic. Yet Joshua's tone is not triumphalist. He warns about remaining populations, future compromise, and covenant disloyalty. This is important because it corrects simplistic conquest narratives. The story does not end with permanent, secure utopia. Ongoing challenges remain. Faithfulness remains necessary. Leadership transition does not eliminate future risk. Historically, farewell speeches by major leaders often serve political consolidation purposes. They frame history, reinforce legitimacy, define acceptable future behavior, and shape succession expectations. Joshua's speeches fit this broader, ancient pattern, but with distinctive covenant emphasis. He is not merely preserving political order. He is preserving theological identity. That distinction is essential. Then comes the great assembly at Shechem. This location is profoundly symbolic. Shechem carries deep ancestral resonance within Israel's memory, associated with earlier patriarchal narratives and covenant significance. Joshua's choice is not accidental. Political communication is shaped by symbolic geography. By gathering the nation there, Joshua anchors present decision within ancestral continuity. The speech in Joshua 24 is masterful historical theology. Joshua narrates the story beginning with Abraham's origins beyond the river, moving through patriarchal history, Egyptian bondage, Exodus deliverance, wilderness experience, conquest, and present inheritance. This is not neutral history writing. It is identity formation through selective sacred memory. Every nation tells stories about its origins. Joshua's narrative tells Israel who they are by reminding them what God has done. But then the speech turns sharply. Choice. This is where the chapter reaches its emotional and rhetorical peak. Choose this day whom you will serve. Modern readers often encounter this phrase detached from its full context, reduced to generic motivational spirituality. In reality, it emerges from a serious covenant confrontation. Joshua is not inviting abstract philosophical reflection. He is demanding political and spiritual clarity. Competing loyalties remain possible: ancestral gods, regional deities, cultural compromise. Covenant fidelity is not automatic simply because history has been dramatic. Human loyalty remains unstable. Joshua knows this from decades of lived experience. His own declaration is unforgettable. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That line has become culturally iconic, but in context it is not decorative inspiration. It is leadership commitment under conditions of uncertainty. Joshua cannot guarantee the nation's future faithfulness. He can declare his own. This is a profoundly mature leadership move. He does not manipulate with false certainty. He models decision. The people respond enthusiastically, affirming commitment. But Joshua's reaction is startling. He does not immediately celebrate. Instead, he challenges their confidence, warning about the seriousness of covenant holiness. This moment is psychologically brilliant. Joshua understands emotional declarations are easier than durable obedience. He has watched this nation repeatedly promise loyalty under pressure, then falter later. His skepticism is not cynicism, it is realism. Leaders who know history resist shallow optimism. Yet covenant renewal proceeds. Witness structures are established. A stone memorial is set up as testimony. Again, material memory matters. Ancient covenant cultures embedded identity in physical symbolic markers. Memory needed anchors. Joshua understands that speeches alone fade. Symbols reinforce continuity. Theologically, this chapter reveals Joshua at his fullest maturity. Earlier chapters highlighted courage, obedience, military leadership, and administrative competence. Here we see his deepest concern: spiritual continuity. This is profoundly important because it reframes his entire legacy. If Joshua were merely a conqueror, his story would end with territorial control. Instead, the climax centers on covenant allegiance. That tells us how the narrative defines true leadership success. Yet there is also a sobering tension. Joshua can call for faithfulness, but he cannot permanently secure it. History after Joshua will prove that painfully. This makes the farewell deeply human. Great leaders can shape institutions, model conviction, and warn clearly. But they cannot eliminate future human agency. Legacy always contains uncertainty. Historically, farewell speeches often attempt to control narrative memory. Joshua certainly shapes memory, but not for personal glorification. His own achievements recede behind covenant emphasis. That restraint is striking. Many leaders nearing death become obsessed with reputation management. Joshua's concern is communal fidelity, not personal monument building. That strengthens his portrait considerably. There is also a subtle but profound leadership contrast with Moses. Moses' farewell in Deuteronomy is expansive, legal, prophetic, emotionally layered, and institutionally foundational. Joshua's farewell is shorter, sharper, more historically retrospective, and focused on covenant choice within inherited structures. Different leaders, different voices. Same covenant tradition. Joshua does not imitate Moses mechanically. He speaks in a way appropriate to his own era and role. That authenticity matters. Another critical insight is Joshua's understanding of idolatry as more than formal religious switching. Competing loyalties can emerge culturally, politically, psychologically. The covenant challenge is fundamentally about allegiance. That makes the speech enduringly relevant beyond ancient specifics. Human communities constantly negotiate competing objects of trust and identity. By the end of this chapter, Joshua's transformation is complete. The former slave became a soldier. The soldier became an apprentice. The apprentice became a successor. The successor became a conqueror. The conqueror became a nation builder. And now the nation builder becomes a covenant witness confronting the future with sober clarity. Chapter 15 matters because it reveals Joshua's greatest act may not have been crossing rivers or defeating cities. It may have been telling the truth about what would matter most after he was gone. Because in the end, military victories shape borders. Covenant choices shape civilizations. Every great story eventually reaches the point where action gives way to memory. The battles are over. The speeches have been delivered. The institutions have been shaped. The promises, at least in meaningful narrative form, have been partially realized. And now we arrive at the final chapter of Joshua's life. Not simply to watch a leader die, but to ask the deeper question every historical narrative eventually forces upon us. What remains when the leader is gone? Joshua 24 closes with extraordinary simplicity. After these things, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. The phrasing is deeply significant. Servant of the Lord. That title matters. Moses had carried it prominently. Joshua now receives it. This is not casual language. It represents theological honor, covenant legitimacy, and narrative closure. The former slave child from Egypt, the battlefield commander against Amalek, the faithful spy, the wilderness survivor, the successor under impossible pressure, the conqueror, the administrator, the covenant witness, is remembered not first as military genius, but as servant. That is how the biblical narrative wants his legacy framed. The age of 110 also carries interesting resonance. In ancient Near Eastern cultural contexts, such ages could symbolize fullness, honor, or idealized completion, though interpretive caution is wise. Biblical narrative often communicates significance through stylized numerical patterns as well as literal memory claims, and scholars approach such details through varying frameworks. What matters narratively is the sense of complete closure. Joshua's life reaches a fitting endpoint. He is buried in the territory assigned to him, reinforcing one final symbolic point. The man who spent decades pursuing promised inheritance dies within that inheritance. There is poetic completion here. Yet the chapter includes more than Joshua's death. Joseph's bones are buried. Eleazar dies. Leadership generations close together. These details matter because the text is signaling transition beyond an individual biography. An era is ending. Foundational memory is being consolidated. Patriarchal promises, exodus, deliverance, conquest, settlement, priestly continuity, all are being woven into a larger narrative arc. Joshua's death is not isolated biography. It is covenant history, closing one chapter and preparing another. The immediate biblical evaluation is strikingly positive. Israel served the Lord during Joshua's lifetime and during the days of the elders who outlived him and knew the great works done for Israel. That statement is important, but also sobering. During Joshua's lifetime, during the generation with living memory. Implicitly, the text warns what happens when memory fades. And indeed, the book of Judges begins with a devastating assessment of later instability. This introduces one of the central tensions in evaluating Joshua's legacy. Was he successful? In one sense, unquestionably, yes. He completed the transition after Moses, led Israel into the land, preserved covenant identity, managed national crises, distributed inheritance, and maintained stability during his lifetime. By almost any leadership metric, that is extraordinary. But if long-term national faithfulness becomes the benchmark, the story becomes more complicated. No leader controls future generations completely. That tension is historically universal. Great founders often build systems that later weaken. Theologically, Joshua's legacy is deeply respected in Jewish and Christian tradition. In Hebrew memory, he stands as Moses' faithful successor and a central conquest-era leader. Later Jewish interpretation reflects varied emphases, from covenant obedience to military leadership. In Christian interpretation, Joshua often acquires typological significance because the Greek form of his name, Jesus, corresponds linguistically with Jesus in later contexts, though historical identities remain entirely distinct. This linguistic overlap contributed to theological reflection, especially in early Christian readings concerned with fulfillment themes. But if we move from theological memory to historical inquiry, the questions become significantly more complex. Was there a historical Joshua in something like the biblical sense? Did a unified conquest occur as described? How should the book of Joshua be read as historical literature? These questions have generated enormous academic debate. Older maximalist readings often assumed relatively straightforward correspondence between narrative and event. Later critical scholarship introduced far greater skepticism, especially as archaeology complicated simplistic conquest models. Excavation data across sites such as Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor produced mixed and debated evidence. Some sites raised chronological difficulties for traditional conquest timelines. Others offered destruction layers whose interpretation remained contested. This does not produce a single neat conclusion. Scholarly positions vary widely. Some argue for a historical core behind conquest traditions shaped through later literary theology. Others favor gradual emergence models involving settlement processes rather than rapid military takeover. Some emphasize ideological historiography rather than straightforward event reporting. Still others maintain more conservative, harmonizing approaches. Serious scholarship recognizes that the conversation is complex, not resolved by simplistic certainty from either direction. Another major academic issue concerns authorship and composition. Traditional attribution often links Joshua within broader covenant historical continuity, but modern scholarship commonly situates the book within discussions of Deuteronomistic history, a literary framework connecting Deuteronomy through Kings with theological editorial shaping. According to many scholars, Joshua's narrative reflects theological interpretation of Israel's past, rather than neutral chronological reportage in modern historiographical terms. That does not make the text meaningless or deceptive. Ancient historical writing operated with different conventions, integrating theology, identity formation, memory, and narrative purpose. Understanding genre is essential. Ethical questions also remain unavoidable. Modern readers often struggle deeply with conquest texts, especially narratives involving judgment language and destruction motifs. These concerns are legitimate and serious. Responsible interpretation does not dismiss them casually. Scholars, theologians, and readers across traditions continue wrestling with how such texts should be understood historically, literarily, ethically, and theologically. Hyperbolic ancient war rhetoric, theological judgment frameworks, literary convention, and historical ambiguity all shape the conversation, but none eliminate the moral weight entirely. Joshua remains a figure who invites admiration and difficult reflection simultaneously. Yet perhaps the most historically human question is simpler. Who was Joshua as a leader? Looking across the entire narrative, a pattern emerges. He was not introduced with dramatic prophetic spectacle. He grew through service. He learned through proximity. He endured long delay. He survived failure. He made mistakes. He adapted from warfare to governance. He valued covenant memory. He understood symbolic leadership. He knew that external victory without internal fidelity was fragile. In many ways, Joshua is one of the most realistic leadership portraits in biblical literature, precisely because his development feels gradual, cumulative, and historically textured. He is neither flawless superhero nor failed cautionary tale. He is a complex leader formed across crisis and responsibility. And perhaps that explains why his story has endured for millennia. Because the complete story of Joshua is not merely about conquest. It is about transition. What happens when a people lose a giant like Moses? What kind of leader emerges from slavery, wilderness, and long preparation? How does leadership evolve from battlefield courage into institutional stewardship? How does memory shape national identity? These are timeless questions. Joshua's death closes his biography, but not his influence. The book ends. The debates continue. The legacy remains. And perhaps the final irony is this. Joshua spent his life leading people into inheritance. Yet history remembers him not primarily for what he possessed, but for the extraordinary burden he was willing to carry.